Hello and welcome to the sixth, I think it is, yes, sixth example of Christians who followed Jesus, and in their discipleship they showed what it meant to be sharing and serving and sacrifice. Um, Today is actually one of Jesus's disciples while he was alive, not one of the 12, but one of the women who were disciples of Jesus, who followed him around. Her name was Salome, sometimes known as Mary Salome. She may have been a cousin of Jesus's mother. Nobody's really sure, but it's suggested that may be. And she was the mother of James and John, the second pair of fisherfolk that Jesus called to be his disciple. And she's not mentioned a lot. I first think of her at the time when James and John leave their nets and go off with Simon and Andrew to be disciples of Jesus. And when Zebedee, her husband, um, comes home and says to her, "Oh, by the way, James and John have quit the business to go and be a disciple of Jesus," it must have been a bit of a shock for her, and she must have been a bit worried about her two boys. She no doubt hears something of what the disciples are doing, and both she and Zebedee must have been concerned when shortly after Jesus calls them as disciples, he takes his disciples for a meal after the calling of Matthew, the tax collector. And there's a story of Jesus at this meal with his disciples and tax collectors and other sinners. And this would have been very annoying for them, for Salome and Zebedee, because it was the tax collectors who set the price of fish, and fishermen didn't really get the best deal out of this nationalization, really, I suppose, of the fishing industry that the Romans had introduced. And she was probably quite angry that James and John had gone and had a meal at the home of an enemy, a tax collector. So I can only imagine how the mother felt. But she obviously eventually comes to terms with what her sons are doing, and continues to love them and want to care for them. So much so that in one of the Gospels it's reported she goes to Jesus on their behalf, on behalf of James and John, to say, "Could they, Jesus, be at your right hand and your left hand when you come into glory?" And Jesus looks at her and says, "Are you sure what you're asking on their behalf? Can they endure what I've got to endure?" But she wanted the best for her sons and felt she needed to speak up on behalf of them. So far we've thought of her as a devoted mother whose first priority was the well-being of her sons. But we don't hear of her again until the crucifixion. And there she is in the crowd. Mark reports in his gospel. Some women were watching from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James the Younger and of Joseph, and Salome. She was there at the foot of the cross when almost all of the male disciples had run away. Not her son John, of course, because he was there at the foot of the cross and Jesus spoke to him, but James and all the other disciples had gone. So she wasn't there on behalf of her boys or concerned for her boys. She was there as a disciple in her own right, as a follower of Jesus, as a believer in Jesus. And she stood at the foot of the cross, going through the pain that any lover of Jesus would go through, seeing him crucified. And yet the women, didn't seem to doubt Jesus when he said he would be resurrected. The men gave up very easily. But she was one of the women who went on the Sunday morning in order to anoint Jesus' body with spices. We read again in Mark chapter 16, when the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they might go to anoint Jesus' body. And they had no idea how they were going to roll away the stone in front of the tomb. And but they went out of immense faith and desire to serve Jesus, even in his death, and no fear of what was going to happen if they bumped into temple or Roman guards around the tomb. They didn't fear for their own lives. They just wanted to serve Jesus. And of course, they come to the tomb and the stone is rolled away. And there's a young man there who, in the end, they think was probably an angel, but a young man there who says, "Oh, you're not looking for Jesus, are you? Look, he's not here anymore. He's risen. So go and tell the other disciples what's happened." And of course, rejoicing, they go off and find Peter and the other disciples, who of course don't believe them because they're women. You in those days, you always thought twice about what a woman told you. Was it actually the truth? So anyway, Peter and John, of course, rush off to see the tomb and see for themselves that Jesus has risen. But Salome never stopped being the mother of James and John. But by the end of the story, she found her own role as a disciple. And in a sense, she laid down her role as mother of somebody else and found herself and was willing to risk her life to serve the man she had found as Saviour of the world. And I think Salome is an amazing example to us all, but mainly, I guess, to mothers, to say, yes, of course you love your children, but for the sake of your own salvation, you must come to a point where Jesus is first, and then others, like your children, and then yourself.